Most secret projects get buried forever. This one didn't. The CIA's Stargate program, once dismissed as science fiction, has resurfaced with renewed attention in 2023 to 2025. The program ran for about 2 decades and was officially closed in 1995 after a formal review, leaving behind thousands of pages of once classified files. Now those declassified documents, combined with recent academic work and open digital trials, have reopened the debate. At the center is Joseph McMoney, Remote Viewer 001. With modern tools and fresh analysis, can the old claims survive renewed scrutiny? That lingering question leads us to why this secret refused to die. The secret that refused to die. When most Cold War experiments wound down, they disappeared quietly into archives, dismissed as dead ends. But one of the strangest, an effort to test whether people could perceive distant places using only their mind, did not vanish in the same way. Born in the 1970s, against the backdrop of escalating nuclear rivalry, the idea sounded implausible from the start. Remote viewing, claiming to describe hidden targets without being physically present, was often grouped with pseudoscience and staged tricks. Yet despite ridicule, the concept persisted inside official budgets for more than 20 years. Because of Cold War fears and repeated internal evaluations, agencies funded remote viewing research across multiple program names: Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and eventually Stargate, from the 1970s through the 1990s. Each cycle of review left skeptics questioning its value, yet each reauthorization meant more reports, more sessions, and more classified experiments tucked away from the public eye. Instead of quietly vanishing, the project showed resilience that raises its own questions. Part of this endurance came from timing. In the climate of the Cold War, rumors carried weight. Reports circulated that the Soviet Union was training psychics for military intelligence, perhaps even exploring their use to influence decision-makers at a distance. For U.S. officials, the risk of lagging behind, even in a field many doubted, was enough to justify keeping the work alive. Approval for funding in those years wasn't driven only by belief in the science. It was shaped by fear of losing any potential edge. In intelligence briefings, even the suggestion of Soviet progress was enough to push another year of support through Congress and the defense budget. Inside the agencies themselves, the debates were constant. Analysts pointed to vague descriptions, inconsistent results, and the lack of a clear mechanism explaining how remote viewing could work. Established intelligence communities argued that reliable satellite images and field operatives provided far more concrete results. Yet, year after year, despite those critiques, the program continued. Dismissals and doubts filled the record, but they never added up to termination, not until the political environment shifted. That tension between skepticism and continuation defines much of Stargate's history. Some of the files show instances that appeared unusually accurate, sketches resembling hidden sites, or impressions that seemed to match later discoveries. These moments fueled enough belief, or at least enough hesitation, that officials concluded the small cost of funding was preferable to the risk of abandoning something their rivals might exploit. Other explanations also circulated: a culture of bureaucratic inertia, officials reluctant to cancel a program that might later prove valuable. Between scattered successes, fear of Soviet research, and institutional survival, the work was renewed again and again. The eventual shutdown did not come because the program was forgotten or ignored. By the 1990s, the Cold War had ended, budgets tightened, and public scrutiny over unusual expenditures grew sharper. At that point, defending a psychic spying unit inside an intelligence budget became politically costly. When the program was formally reviewed by the American Institutes for Research in 1995, the conclusion was direct. The experiments had not produced actionable intelligence that could be used alone in real operations. At the same time, statistician Jessica Utz, reviewing the same data, argued that the laboratory results showed anomalies unlikely to be explained by chance. Her analysis suggested something unusual was present at the statistical level, even if it had not translated into reliable tools for missions. That divided assessment captures the core of why the program ended. Officially, it was dropped because it failed to provide usable information for decision-makers in the field. Unofficially, uneven performance and political risk made continuing untenable. Supporters argued that many traditional methods also suffered from errors, missed signals, and flawed interpretation. Critics countered that inconsistency was far less forgivable when the method itself lacked clear scientific grounding. Once the balance of political safety and practical usefulness shifted, termination was inevitable. In hindsight, the very longevity of remote viewing research is what makes it notable. Government budgets rarely support projects for over 2 decades unless decision-makers sense at least some compelling results or risks in abandoning them. Stargate was neither hailed as a breakthrough nor discarded immediately as fantasy. Instead, it occupied an unusual space, tolerated because of its potential, shut down once its liabilities outweighed its promise. The independent review marked its official close, but the questions it raised did not stop with that decision. What stands out is less about the ending itself and more about how long it avoided that outcome. Line items across 20 years of defense budgets signaled the interest of people in positions of authority. They were not mystics or casual believers. They were career professionals with bureaucratic oversight looking for intelligence advantages during uncertain times. Continuing meant they saw just enough reason not to dismiss the idea fully. That choice left behind a record that still stirs debate even today. The secret survival across administrations and changing climates points to something deeper than a whimsical experiment. At different points, someone inside the program saw enough in a set of sketches or descriptions to push for renewal. Those moments, paired with a climate of geopolitical rivalry, were sufficient to keep the operation alive until circumstances shifted. What ended in 1995 was not the conversation, but the official sponsorship. Outside of government channels, the practice would continue to develop in other hands. And it's here, among the individuals tasked with putting the theory into practice, that the story becomes less abstract and more human. Within the program, one figure emerged whose work defined how the effort was judged, tested, and remembered. Joseph McMoney, Remote Viewer 001. Joseph McMoney was given a designation unlike any other, Remote Viewer 001. He was the first individual formally recruited into the U.S. Army's early remote viewing program, not as a curiosity, but as someone tested under controlled conditions at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI. According to transcripts from those initial experiments, McMoney achieved unusually high hit rates, reported as 5 out of 6 accurate matches during his first blind target sessions. Those early results, recorded in SRI documentation and later mentioned in interviews, singled him out inside a research environment where many others failed to rise above guesswork. His military background added weight to the story. Before ever entering a lab, McMoney had served as an Army officer in Vietnam, where pressures of combat required quick decisions based on subtle cues. Soldiers in those environments often talked about gut instinct, a heightened awareness shaped by life or death experience. For him, this sharpened intuition endured after the war and emerged in ways his colleagues found unusual. The same calmness under stress and readiness to trust impressions became features of his reputation long before the word psychic was ever attached. This background made him a compelling candidate when the Army explored unconventional approaches to intelligence gathering. At SRI, researchers such as Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ structured experiments to limit knowledge of targets and prevent coaching. Most participants produced vague impressions, but the statistical strength of McMoney's early sessions set him apart. The documented patterns suggested information emerging beyond ordinary inference, at least within the small number of trials. Reports forwarded to government sponsors emphasized his consistency, and by the late 1970s, he was recognized as the program's first fully designated remote viewer. Citing these sessions, advocates for the project argued in funding reviews that at least one individual had demonstrated repeatable ability worth further investment. The practical side of his work was what kept superiors watching. Remote viewing could only justify its place if it produced specific, verifiable data. McMoney gained attention because his sketches of buildings, descriptions of terrain, or impressions of industrial features occasionally aligned with independent reconnaissance. For intelligence officers cautious about anything that sounded speculative, documentation mattered. In multiple accounts, his sessions were pointed to as evidence during bureaucratic debates about whether the project deserved another year. While not the sole reason Stargate survived so long, his ongoing high-level performance was one of the significant factors cited by internal supporters when budget renewals came under question. McMoney's personal philosophy also reinforced continuity. He insisted on blind conditions, careful controls, and adequate documentation. He did not encourage publicity or spectacle, instead treating remote viewing as a trainable skill bound by protocol. In interviews, he described resisting looser demonstrations precisely because such formats invited contamination and eroded credibility. Within the lab, his willingness to follow scientific structure helped convince collaborating researchers that they were observing something other than chance alone. The result was a rare degree of trust between subject and scientist, which influenced how reports on the program were written. Critics inside and outside intelligence never accepted the results without challenge. Psychologist Ray Hyman and others emphasized concerns about the experimental methods at SRI, pointing out risks of sensory leakage and problems with interjudge scoring reliability. Some sessions, they argued, may have been unintentionally biased by subtle cues. These criticisms were documented both during and after the program's life, and later became part of the American Institutes for Research, AIR, 1995 review. That review concluded the experiments were intriguing, but did not demonstrate clear operational utility. Even so, McMoney's laboratory record endured as a sticking point. Those who believed the phenomenon was real pointed to his transcripts as the strongest evidence to date. Throughout the early 1980s and beyond, McMoney's sessions continued to attract attention inside intelligence circles. Accounts describe instances where he produced information weeks before it was confirmed through conventional means, as well as times when his data missed the mark entirely. He himself often acknowledged that his success rate was not perfect, yet proponents argued it exceeded the level of chance enough to warrant continued use. In cost-benefit terms, even partial accuracy in areas unreachable by satellites or human sources could justify retaining the capability. As the program matured, McMoney took on an additional role beyond raw participation. He emphasized training, teaching that remote viewing required discipline, and the stripping away of imaginative embellishment. His approach resonated with students who reported success in their own first sessions, reinforcing the idea that the skill could be passed on. By the time the program began winding down in the early 1990s, he had already shifted partly into consulting, bringing structured methodology into corporate projects and later into public training sessions. His continued activity ensured the practice did not die out entirely when government sponsorship ended. The question of how much credit belongs to him has fueled debate ever since. Advocates stress that his body of transcripts demonstrates patterns not readily explained by guessing. Skeptics counter that the best evidence still falls short of proving operational value, pointing again to Ayer's conclusion that the data did not meet intelligence needs. Interviews with McMoney highlight his own balanced perspective. He acknowledged both successes and failures and rejected exaggerated claims. In that respect, his image as Remote Viewer 001 became a symbol not of resolved proof, but of the persistent ambiguity that continues to surround remote viewing. In later years, McMoney remained visible in conferences, teaching sessions, and interviews. His stance never shifted into mysticism. He consistently framed remote viewing as structured perception under disciplined conditions. That pragmatism kept him relevant into the present, where renewed attention to consciousness studies has drawn his name back into public conversation. His career illustrates how one individual could become a case study within both classified and civilian inquiries, continuing to anchor discussion decades after the original program was canceled. When evaluating Stargate in hindsight, the story of McMoney is often embedded in broader debates about design, method, and evidence. His results appeared strong enough to influence funding cycles, but not strong enough to silence critiques. SRI charts, Air reviews, and his own accounts established both sides of the record, the compelling anecdotes and the warnings about limits. This duality reflects the larger story of Stargate itself, moments of startling promise shadowed by methodological doubts. Framed this way, McMoney represents both the promise and the challenge of remote viewing research. His sessions were striking enough to become central points in the internal defense of funding over 20-plus years. But they also became the basis for critics' methodological critiques and remain the locus of debate in modern analysis. Whether interpreted as evidence of an anomalous perceptual ability or as a statistical artifact shaped by context, his role remains the most documented and studied within the Stargate archive. As Stargate entered later phases, expanding under new names and shifting administrative sponsors, other figures joined the story: researchers, military leaders, and additional remote viewers. Each left their mark on how the program developed and how it ultimately faded from official support. To understand how that larger system formed, and how it endured through 2 decades of scrutiny and reinvention, we need to look at the sequence of changes that carried the work from its earliest exploratory years into its longest-running form. Inside the Stargate timeline, the phases that defined Stargate were not a single continuous project under one name, but a sequence of efforts that evolved over 2 decades. Its earliest incarnation, in the early 1970s, was known as Gondola Wish, a pilot effort run under the U.S. Army's oversight. The context at the time was dominated by Cold War anxiety. Reports circulated that the Soviet Union was investing heavily in psychic research, not only exploring perception at a distance, but also attempts at psychokinesis. Even the possibility that Moscow might be ahead in such an unusual field was considered enough to justify, at least limited investigation. Gondola Wish began as a small, tentative experiment to see whether human perception could extend beyond normal sensory limits under conditions designed to prevent trickery or suggestion. The work quickly intersected with outside scientific partners. At the Stanford Research Institute in California, physicists Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ were contracted to design experiments that imposed controls tighter than what military officers could easily manage. Their laboratory approach emphasized blind protocols, ensuring that neither the viewer nor the experimenter present in the room knew the target. This insistence on structure allowed results to be graded against chance expectations in ways that casual psychic demonstrations could not. Although much of the data was mixed, some of the outputs impressed sponsors enough to warrant further funding. It was at SRI that artist and subject Ingo Swann played a pivotal role. Swann not only participated in sessions, but also helped formalize the process into a step-by-step method later called Controlled Remote Viewing, CRV. By breaking down impressions into stages such as sketches, sensory descriptors, or conceptual cues, Swann's system reduced the risk of imagination overwhelming raw perceptions. For the Army, his contribution shifted remote viewing from being seen purely as a rare gift of a few individuals towards something that might be teachable and replicable. This prospect of a trainable method strengthened the argument that the research deserved continuation. Support inside military leadership was crucial for survival. Funding was never large, but in the competitive atmosphere of the Cold War, high-ranking officials concluded that even a low-cost chance of accessing otherwise inaccessible intelligence targets was preferable to nothing at all. With every new round of defense appropriations, the program migrated to new offices and acquired new names. Gondola Wish gave way to Grill Flame in the late 1970s, then to Center Lane in the early 1980s. Each time, the research narrative was adjusted to reassure skeptics, but the central premise remained intact. Test whether trained personnel could describe locations or events beyond ordinary means. By the mid-1980s, the effort transitioned to the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, where it became Sunstreak. Eventually, as it consolidated under later contracts with Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, the work carried the umbrella name Stargate. Though small in scale compared to satellites, surveillance aircraft, or human assets, the program managed to secure budget lines year after year. Reports show that decision-makers occasionally turned to remote viewing summaries when conventional intelligence was absent. There were accounts of sessions that produced sketches resembling concealed buildings, descriptions of hostages' conditions, or depictions of restricted weapons facilities. While the accuracy varied widely, some of these examples were persuasive enough to be cited when critics pushed for termination. In practice, the data was not used as standalone intelligence but as supplementary detail, sometimes included in briefings alongside other forms of collection. The political and cultural environment, however, was not stable. In the aftermath of CIA scandals and congressional inquiries into covert abuses during the late 1970s and early 1980s, unconventional projects faced harsher scrutiny. Psychic spying was easy to ridicule if it reached the public's attention, and officials worried about reputational damage. Within closed meetings, supporters argued that Stargate's minimal cost and occasional successes justified its existence. Yet oversight bodies increasingly asked not whether the method produced anomalies, but what embarrassment might follow if taxpayers learned their dollars were being spent on psychics. Managers responded by restricting the program's visibility, burying it deeper within, classified budgets, and minimizing outside exposure. Despite unease, the Cold War itself kept the program alive. As long as the possibility of Soviet research remained, whether validated or not, the argument for American participation carried weight. It was politically more acceptable to continue funding small-scale experiments than to risk being accused of falling behind an adversary in any sphere. Skepticism persisted on the technical side, but strategically, the cost was so minor compared to weapons systems that continued support could be rationalized. By the late 1980s, this balance began to shift. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War removed the urgency that had shielded Stargate from cancellation. With shrinking defense budgets in the early 1990s and new demands for efficiency, programs that appeared eccentric or outdated lost powerful defenders. Stargate contracted in scope, the team reduced to a handful of personnel working at DIA and later under SAIC's management. Some intelligence customers still placed occasional tasking requests, but enthusiasm within agencies no longer matched the earlier decades. The project subsisted as a vestige rather than a priority, vulnerable to growing skepticism both inside and outside government. Its end came in 1995, when Congress directed a formal evaluation and the CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research, AIR, to review the evidence. Two independent analysts were asked to assess the findings, statistician Jessica Utz and psychologist Ray Hyman. Utz concluded that the laboratory database contained statistically significant results, patterns too strong to be dismissed as chance alone, though she noted the difficulty of converting them into reliable intelligence practice. Hyman, in contrast, emphasized methodological flaws such as inadequate controls and potential biases, arguing that the data did not justify confidence in the phenomenon. The AIR report itself acknowledged intriguing anomalies, but concluded that the information provided was unreliable for operational use. That combination of ambivalent findings gave officials the grounds to terminate the program without appearing dismissive of science. The closure of Stargate was not driven by a single reason. It resulted from the confluence of factors. The Cold War had ended, budgets were contracting, public oversight was increasing, and the AIR evaluation provided an authoritative basis for stopping further funding. Political risk outweighed any marginal benefit that occasional successes might have offered. Officially, the line item was erased, and in 1995 the program was declared shut down. Yet looking at the classified history, what stands out is its duration. From the initial SRI tests of the early 1970s to its termination in 1995, the program survived 21 years. It outlasted many more conventional projects and spanned shifts in presidential administrations, agency leadership, and global politics. For something often described as fringe, that longevity reflected not just curiosity, but sustained institutional support. Intelligence officers and military advocates often had little patience for unproven ideas, and yet this one occupied a place in classified budgets for over 2 decades. That endurance suggests it was perceived as more than a passing oddity. Understanding how Stargate threaded its way through bureaucracies, scientific partnerships, and shifting geopolitical pressures provides context for why it remains controversial even today. But the real question is not only why it lasted, but also what exactly the practice entailed. To make sense of its reputation and the claims made on its behalf, we need to look at what remote viewing was understood to be inside those laboratories and classified rooms, and how its methods differed from popular misconceptions. What remote viewing really is. Remote viewing has often been confused with fortune-telling or presented alongside palm reading and seance-style theatrics. That comparison caught the public imagination because both seem to involve seeing what others can't. But what was attempted under U.S. government contracts at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, and later military labs was framed very differently. Remote viewing was designed to operate more like a protocol-driven experiment than stage performance. The goal wasn't prophecy or communication with spirits. It was to test whether people could describe concealed targets they had no ordinary access to, under controlled conditions meant to block hints or guesswork. Researchers at SRI stressed that their procedures were not rituals, but systematic attempts to record perceptions in stripped-down settings where errors or successes could be judged against clear benchmarks. At SRI, this distinction was reinforced through stringent safeguards. Viewers were seated in undecorated rooms with only a monitor present, and neither viewer nor monitor knew the target in advance. Targets were randomized, stored in sealed envelopes, or assigned by staff completely separate from the experiment team. These measures introduced what scientists call double-blind and target randomization protocols. They were meant to reduce sensory leakage. the possibility that unintentional cues or experimenter knowledge could guide answers, and to minimize judge bias when results were scored. Viewers produced written notes, sketches, or verbal impressions, which were archived immediately. Later, judges compared those records to the sealed targets, allowing numerical scoring of matches and misses. SRI's emphasis on these measures was a response to earlier failures in parapsychology. In looser setups, researchers might inadvertently signal clues to participants, or targets might be predictable enough to allow reasoning rather than perception. By eliminating those gaps, SRI positioned its work as an attempt at scientific testing rather than exhibition. Yet even here, critics such as David Marks and Richard Kamen later examined SRI transcripts and showed that some early experiments still contained subtle cues, page formatting, references and session notes, that could help judges unconsciously match a transcript to its intended target. Their analysis highlighted how difficult it was to create conditions immune to leakage despite the precautions. Because of these challenges, performance results varied widely. Many recruits never produced anything beyond chance-level guesses, while a small subset of individuals appeared to generate correlations stronger than random models predicted. This inconsistency inspired training programs. Ingo Swann, an artist and longtime subject at SRI, helped codify a sequence known as controlled remote viewing, CRV. His system broke perception into stages, basic sensory impressions, shapes, sketches, conceptual descriptors, to reduce imaginative embellishment. Under strict protocols, some trainees improved, but outside those conditions, suggestive coaching often crept in. When that occurred, data quality collapsed, and critics used those failures to dismiss the entire practice. So the fault line became clear. In highly controlled settings with double-blind safeguards, a few individuals produced results SRI reported as statistically stronger than chance. Government sponsors drew attention to numbers showing 70 to 80% correspondence between descriptions and targets in those limited cases, pointing to them as justification to continue funding. But later reevaluations made the picture more complicated. Psychologists and statisticians reviewing the same records often flagged insufficient controls, problematic randomization, or scoring mistakes. This left the findings in a contested state, suggestive to some, flawed to others. SRI itself attempted to address critiques by tightening protocols over time, but by then the doubt reached beyond technical details, cutting into the credibility of the field as a whole. A typical example illustrates both allure and fragility. In one controlled trial, a viewer described tall metallic forms aligned in rows near water without knowing the target. The sealed envelope later revealed a photograph of a naval shipyard. One such episode could be coincidence, but in sequences of dozens of trials, seeing patterns emerge made analysts treat them as more than luck. Supporters argued that even occasional correlations beyond chance justified keeping the research alive, especially when traditional intelligence methods also carried high error rates. Critics countered that the scoring process itself, or subtle leaks in transcripts, could create illusions of accuracy without any true anomaly. The same case could be read both ways depending on assumptions about the protocol. This divided interpretation carried into intelligence use. In practice, remote viewing was never expected to stand alone. Analysts compared it to other imperfect sources, spy satellites, intercepted signals, human informants, and asked whether it provided above-chance cues that might direct further collection. Under this narrower standard, even partial reliability made it seem worth a minor budget line. But credibility depended on strict conditions. Whenever sessions drifted into looser, cue-filled formats, the value all but vanished. Viewers themselves, including Joseph McMoney, acknowledged that undisciplined settings invited error and undermined performance. Methodological debate remained constant. Followers highlighted years when results suggested patterns exceeding random expectation. Skeptics emphasized that later replications failed and that closer audits exposed flaws. Both perspectives are accurate in part. SRI attempted a scientific protocol and in some cases reported statistically significant findings. Later reviews uncovered cueing, scoring problems, and replication gaps. Remote viewing ended its government life neither validated as fact nor dismissed as pure fraud. It remained suspended in this gray zone, where interpretation depended on one's tolerance for ambiguity and risk. That ambiguity shaped training programs too. Some military units treated remote viewing as a tool requiring discipline much like map reading or code systems. procedures to be practiced, refined, and kept under strict rules. In those circles, emphasis was on blind conditions, exacting note-taking, and minimizing chatter. Elsewhere, under less rigorous oversight, sessions shaded into subjective psychic readings that invited ridicule. These uneven practices explain why the field was never able to present a unified case. The same name, remote viewing, covered both tight experimental trials and vague, uncontrolled demonstrations, fuel for both advocates and critics. As the program matured through the 1980s and early 1990s, official reports came back to the same lesson. Remote viewing showed its strongest results when confined to strict double-blind structures, randomization schedules, and neutral judging procedures. Those settings sometimes yielded data that resisted easy dismissal. When protocols were relaxed, accuracy rates plummeted and credibility eroded. Supporters maintained that the enduring record of controlled anomalies merited further exploration. Skeptics held that methodological flaws and lack of consistent replication undercut the entire claim. Both sides used the same datasets to argue opposite conclusions. When declassified documents became available years later, readers saw the debate in raw form. One memo celebrated sessions with striking correspondences. Another pointed out that misplaced control procedures tainted validation. In balance, remote viewing appears not as a miracle or hoax, but as a prolonged contest between design and doubt. Every reported success came with questions about leakage, bias, or scoring. Every critical audit had to acknowledge that some correlations appeared difficult to explain with chance alone. The very tension between promise and flaw kept the subject alive longer than most other fringe experiments buried in archives. Remote viewing, then, is best understood not as mystical power, but as controlled trials designed to test perception under blind conditions. At SRI and later under other contractors, researchers tried to measure patterns against probability, creating data that sometimes crossed thresholds surprising even hardened analysts. But it is equally important to recognize that replication often failed, critiques identified real weaknesses, and the record remains contested. It sits between belief and dismissal, never comfortably embraced by either side. While these arguments shaped policy debates, what ultimately drew attention were the individual sessions that seemed to reach beyond chance. Descriptions, sketches, and reports that hinted at hidden places or classified structures. Some of these events were declassified decades later. Their details still spark discussion today and raise the question of how seriously intelligence officials regarded them at the time. The successes that couldn't be ignored. Much of Stargate's story is buried within documents that remain incomplete or partly redacted. The files released over the years offer session notes, test transcripts, and fragments of evaluations, but large portions of text still sit behind black rectangles. That secrecy has shaped how people interpret the program. For those on the outside, missing pages encourage speculation. For those who worked inside, they act as reminders that reported successes were sometimes too sensitive to enter the public record. What has been released, however, includes enough examples to show that certain outcomes stood out as dramatic enough that they were used in arguments to keep the program alive despite skepticism. These reported cases, scattered throughout declassified files, are what gave Stargate its stubborn longevity. One frequently cited case involved a missing American believed to be in hostile territory. According to program records, conventional search and rescue strategies had reached a standstill. A remote viewer was tasked with providing impressions of the individual's location. The notes described surrounding terrain, structural features, and distinguishing details in the environment. Later reconnaissance found that the hostage was indeed located in an area that resembled parts of the viewer's sketch. Reports indicate this session was seen by some commanders as operationally valuable. At the same time, later evaluators warned that some of Stargate's dramatic hits may have involved prior background information or selective reporting, meaning such cases cannot be taken as definitive evidence without caution. Another reported case dealt with descriptions of hidden Soviet facilities. In this instance, a viewer produced sketches of what looked like unusually large industrial structures situated near water. When intelligence analysts later compared these images with photographic reconnaissance, the similarities drew serious attention. The site was connected to advanced military development activity. Although not every detail matched, the scale was somewhat misjudged and certain technical aspects were missing. Intelligence officers noted that even partial correspondences could help flag a location for follow-up. Again, these documents show remote viewing serving as a supplement, not a replacement for conventional intelligence. Once more, later Air and Skeptic reviews cautioned that selective emphasis on stronger matches contributed to an inflated impression of accuracy, leaving open alternative explanations. The case most often cited by supporters was the emergence of what NATO later identified as the Typhoon-class submarine. Declassified reports and accounts from researchers state that remote viewers had described massive submarine construction halls well before the first photographs confirmed them. One viewer produced sketches of large rounded hull shapes, indicating scale beyond previously known Soviet designs. When reconnaissance eventually documented the enormous double-hull structure, the resemblance to session notes was striking and is widely recognized as one of the program's most debated points. Independent commentators stress that this remains a reported case, not definitive proof, and subsequent reviewers, including Air in 1995 and psychologists like David Marks, emphasized that extraordinary claims required extraordinary replication. Still, the timing of these descriptions, arriving before the first satellite confirmation, is why the Typhoon remains one of the few examples repeatedly raised in serious discussions of Stargate. Another episode often grouped with the Typhoon example is Pat Price's reported session describing installations at Semipalatinsk in the Soviet Union. Archival accounts note that he produced drawings of large gantry cranes and unusual equipment that had not yet appeared in Western intelligence reporting. Later reconnaissance confirmed that such structures existed at the site. Advocates pointed to this as an independent confirmation of remote viewing's potential at its best. However, critical assessments quickly followed. Both Air's evaluation and skeptical researchers such as Marks and Kamen later argued that timing of confirmations, possible access to background references, and selective memory raised alternative possibilities. What survived in the record, then, was less a conclusive discovery and more a contested example that each side pointed to as evidence for its argument. These cases illustrate the tension that always defined the program. For those seeking to cut funding, pointing to repeated vagueness, frequent misses, and unclear operational utility was persuasive. For those who defended it, pointing to even a handful of reported sessions that later aligned with real-world discoveries demonstrated that the program had at least some capability that could not be dismissed entirely. This split reflects the practical side of intelligence. Analysts are trained to weigh probabilities, not to wait for absolute certainty. A sketch that preceded satellite confirmation, even if imperfect, could be enough to justify including remote viewing as a supplementary resource. Because of its mixed record, Stargate often fostered debate within the intelligence community itself. Technical analysts accustomed to signals or imagery sources resented the inclusion of remote viewing, worried it introduced noise or confused the record. Some warned that incorporating speculative sketches risked misdirecting attention. Yet at the same time, certain individuals with backgrounds in field operations saw value in any information that expanded options when handling high-risk situations. Reports from the period suggest that this divide between operational users and headquarters skeptics persisted throughout the program's existence. The public record adds another complication. We only know of certain episodes because they survived the declassification process. Several thousand pages remain either sealed or heavily redacted. Their unseen contents continue to fuel debate, but cannot be treated as evidence. The most careful way to state the situation is this. Some documents are classified, which keeps the record incomplete. This uncertainty supports speculation, but does not itself prove hidden successes. Without access to the full material, the strongest cases we can discuss are the ones found in the released files, always paired with the necessary caution that later reviews insisted upon. Taking the record as it stands, one conclusion seems reasonable. Remote viewing produced inconsistent results, but several documented cases showed descriptions that paralleled subsequent independent discoveries. For intelligence officers accustomed to working within uncertainty, ignoring material that occasionally aligned would have seemed imprudent. Yet the failures and inconsistencies kept skepticism alive. This balance, between reported successes that motivated support and methodological limitations that invited criticism, was precisely what kept the program alive for 20 years, but also ensured it was never fully accepted. The ongoing dilemma is clear. Were these episodes the result of a perception that challenged established science, or were they clever reinterpretations of vague reports remembered after the fact? The 1995 reviews left that question unresolved, affirming that while some statistical anomalies were present, operational reliability was never established. Without cases like the Typhoon sketches or the Semipalatinsk example, the project might have ended much earlier. With them, the debate never fully closed, keeping remote viewing in the government files far longer than most unconventional programs. That unresolved debate is what shaped Stargate's reputation long after its termination. Supporters highlight those few striking reported cases, while critics highlight the inconsistent mass of inconclusive data. The survival of both narratives explains why decades later, the conversation still carries weight. And as the project passed into history, questions emerged about whether science outside of military intelligence might one day provide a clearer framework. It is here that the story shifts. Rather than viewing Stargate only as a Cold War anomaly, the question becomes whether developments in consciousness research and neuroscience in recent years connect with what the program once attempted. That larger context has moved the issue from military archives into current academic debate, where the question is no longer only what remote viewers once reported, but whether science itself is beginning to provide explanations. The 2025 reality, scientific backing emerges. Did remote viewing truly fade as nothing more than an eccentric Cold War experiment, or has modern research begun to provide tools that place it back on the table for careful examination? That question is being asked again in 2025, not because the old CIA files have changed, but because scientific technologies now allow states of awareness to be observed in ways that were impossible during the Stargate years. Where evaluators in 1995 worked only with transcripts and subjective scoring, today researchers bring EEG coherence scans, digital randomization engines, and timestamp protocols into the process. The discussion no longer centers only on anecdotes. It rests on whether new observations support the presence of a measurable effect. From 2020 through 2024, several peer-reviewed studies examined experiences once dismissed as psi. A 1974 to 2022 meta-analysis pooling decades of remote viewing trial data found that when low-quality studies were excluded, the remaining dataset showed a small but statistically significant above-chance effect. In other words, across many published experiments, the probability of targets being described correctly exceeded chance levels, though modestly. Escola Gaskin and colleagues, in a 2023 paper, reported a correlation between higher emotional intelligence and better performance in remote viewing tasks, suggesting that personal traits might influence outcomes. The key takeaway from such publications is not that the matter is settled. Rather, they show that recent meta-analyses and controlled replication efforts keep finding modest effects that resist straightforward dismissal, even as replication remains debated. These results have not moved mainstream consensus very far. Many neuroscientists and psychologists reject the idea of non-local consciousness as too vague to test, and emphasize that effect sizes in meta-analyses remain far smaller than what would be required for practical use. Figures like statistician Jessica Utz have long argued the laboratory. Evidence displays anomalies difficult to explain by chance, but skeptics such as Ray Hyman and earlier reviewers like David Marks maintain that leakage, bias, and methodological errors explain the data more simply. This divide persists in 2025. One camp points to consistent, if weak, signals, while the mainstream continues to label remote viewing as pseudoscience until rigorous replication is established across independent labs. What has changed are the methods. In the 1970s, SRI's protocols still allowed potential cueing. Transcripts and session notes became vulnerable to accidental hints. In contrast, today's trials apply digital blind procedures. From 2023 onward, targets have been randomized by software outside the presence of researchers, and sessions logged electronically with timestamps and cryptographic storage. Judges compare the viewer's output against sealed image banks or geographic coordinates, all without being in contact with experimenters who know the answers. Removing human intermediaries has improved confidence that any correspondences are not products of subconscious signal giving. Parallel with those changes, neuroscience quietly entered the conversation. No laboratory claims remote viewing has been proven, but EEG and brain imaging studies now record unusual neural states when participants attempt sessions. Common findings include temporary hemispheric synchronization and changes in theta-alpha rhythms when subjects report entering what they describe as an RV state. These observations do not demonstrate information transfer. They merely show that participants entered distinctive physiological conditions, not identical to resting wakefulness or ordinary imagination. To researchers, this confirms that something differentiates the state subjectively associated with remote viewing, even if its meaning remains unresolved. Trials conducted between 2023 and 2025 at several universities used these upgraded designs. Viewers were assigned blind targets, photographs, locations, or digital images, held in sealed databases. The expectation for chance matches might be 1 in 4, yet performance occasionally doubled that rate in small groups. Statistically, this move from 25% to 40 to 50% match rates, while far from perfect, registers as a modest but significant effect. Intelligence analysts historically framed small but recurrent anomalies as actionable. Scientists require robust replication before calling them real. That difference in standards drives the continuing debate. Critics continue to remind that small effects can emerge in many psychological experiments, from guessing dice rolls to card identifications, without suggesting paranormal causes. To them, modest above-chance numbers prove only that bias, misscoring, or subconscious reasoning have not been fully eliminated. Supporters respond that describing unknown images or geographic sites under blind digital controls is qualitatively different from card guessing, and that stable above-chance results across meta-analyses indicate something more than artifact. Both positions exist in tension, producing a debate echoing what surrounded Stargate itself. The cultural climate inside academia has shifted only slightly. In the 1990s, writing about Psi could end careers. In the 2020s, careful phrasing permits discussion without instant dismissal, though skepticism stays strong. Articles discussing non-local consciousness, anomalous cognition, or related concepts now appear in mainstream journals with the caveat that results remain contested. Younger researchers explore the field under stricter standards, hoping incremental data may reveal whether a genuine anomaly is present or the appearance of one created by subtle shortcomings in design. For intelligence observers, the parallels with Stargate are hard to miss. Once again, the data is noisy but contains signals some consider too consistent to ignore. Once again, skeptics emphasize replication failures and methodological weaknesses. The difference in 2025 is that digital blind protocols and neuromonitoring make the strongest cases more difficult to dismiss as simple experiment or bias. Whether that becomes enough to change policy remains open. Importantly, even the researchers most supportive of the field speak cautiously. None claim a decisive breakthrough. Instead, they present the view that remote viewing represents low-level, but measurable deviations from chance in multiple double-blind trials. Such deviations remain small and uneven, but they are persistent across datasets in a way that keeps the phenomenon alive in serious conversation. What has emerged is not a radical confirmation, but an upgrade in evidence quality. Better protocols, better statistics, and clearer boundaries for critique. To the public, these developments often go unnoticed, buried in technical graphs and probability curves rather than dramatic spy stories. Yet within research networks, each replication, or each failure, adds weight. To the long-running question, if even modest but consistent results survive in data sets guarded by digital randomization and independent auditing, then remote viewing cannot be dismissed as mere storytelling. At the same time, without stronger replications, it cannot be elevated into established science. This middle ground is where the 2025 debate sits, contested, incremental, but ongoing. Where does that leave the picture? Remote viewing in scientific terms today is neither validated nor discarded. It exists as an anomaly tested under the harshest experiments available, producing slight effects above chance while remaining fragile to replication demands. Neuroscience can record brain changes during sessions, digital protocols can eliminate many prior flaws, and meta-analyses find modest statistical effects. But debate is far from over, and mainstream consensus stays skeptical. This status, a field hovering between intrigue and rejection, is what has allowed the discussion to persist into 2025 without conclusive closure. And while researchers weigh probability curves and EEG data, the reality outside the laboratory raises an even sharper question. If government records once branded remote viewing too unreliable for intelligence, why do signs suggest other nations continue to fund it? That tension opens the door to the next part of the story, where the issue is no longer confined to Western universities and old CIA files, but stretches into present-day intelligence games that have not ended with Stargate's closure. Remote viewing and intelligence today. If there is one question that echoes today, it is whether governments truly put remote viewing behind them after 1995, or whether the idea quietly slipped into other forms. Remote viewing and intelligence today continues to generate attention, not because of official acknowledgement, but because open-source reports and commentators suggest that Russia and China have investigated similar programs. What is missing is hard verification. Independent documentation is scarce, and that absence makes it difficult to separate rumor from fact. Still, the idea that major powers would continue testing methods once explored by the United States remains a point of speculation in security circles. Russia's case often comes up because of its long history of parapsychology research. During the Soviet period, laboratories worked on extrasensory perception, biological signal transmission, and even reported concepts such as bioinformation fields. While Western programs under Stargate focused on lab structure and protocols, Soviet reports blended psychology with broader experiments, sometimes overlapping with cybernetics and human-machine interface designs. After the USSR collapsed, many assumed those labs closed. Yet in the decades since, scattered information has surfaced, military manuals that still reference unusual perception, defectors recalling psychic counterintelligence training, and public claims by former researchers. Open-source accounts make it appear as though Russia never fully stopped, but here caution is essential. Without declassified proof, these remain reports rather than confirmed operations. China's trajectory is more recent and has caught attention precisely because of its scale. Beginning in the 1980s, Chinese research institutes published work under the label of special human functions. Accounts point to children and military trainees being tested for remote perception abilities under stressful conditions, sometimes framed as anticipating battlefield uncertainty. Rumors continue today of state-funded experiments at universities and defense institutes, suggesting that the research has not disappeared. Reports mention claims of locating minerals, describing remote sites, or predicting activity. Yet as with Russia, independent observers cannot confirm what actually occurs inside those programs. The most careful way to frame it is this. Commentators point to Chinese government interest, but verification is limited. What is clear is that funding has persisted, and that persistence keeps speculation alive. The persistence of Russian and Chinese programs, whether active or only rumored, matters for intelligence culture. Decisions inside defense policy are not driven only by verified fact. They're also shaped by what adversaries might believe. If Russian or Chinese officials believe remote viewing yields even occasional useful information, then they may allocate resources to it. That alone can alter the balance of risk. From the US perspective, abandoning its own program while rivals keep experimenting creates unease. This is what gives the subject its staying power. The perception that someone somewhere might still extract value from methods once dismissed in Washington. Note the difference, though, between leaked or declassified files, which form the historical record, and modern open-source rumor. Each requires a different evidentiary standard. Since official sponsorship ended in the United States, remote viewing has not disappeared. It has shifted outward. In the private sector, associative remote viewing, ARV, and paid consultant work have been reported in contexts ranging from mineral exploration to financial forecasting. ARV, a technique that pairs viewer impressions with separate outcomes such as symbols or numbers, has been tested as a decision-making aid. For corporations weighing billion-dollar drilling ventures, hiring a consultant to run a set of ARV sessions is inexpensive insurance. If the sessions suggest avoiding a dry well, and that saves millions, the cost is negligible compared with the potential return. These examples show how even partial belief in a possible anomaly sustains funding streams. Commercial demand, not public validation, is what keeps the practice alive. Resource discovery is a case in point. Companies face enormous expenses and risk when drilling for oil, gas, or precious metals. Alongside geophysical surveys and satellite mapping, some have employed remote viewing consultants as an additional input. Reports describe consultants being asked to provide impressions of favorable sites or early warnings of failures. The information is not used alone, but investors treat it as another layer in a complex decision process. For corporations, even a single instance of avoided loss can justify continued contracts. While little of this appears in official reports, enough evidence of consulting arrangements has surfaced to indicate that the practice persists. Finance is another area where ARV has found a niche. Here, consultants run blind sessions where viewers describe outcomes later linked to yes or no questions about future market moves. Background literature documents experiments in which ARV produced modest above-chance results, though far from predictive certainty. Some hedge funds and private investors have treated it as one more speculative tool alongside technical analysis. The results are not consistent, and skeptics point to statistical noise. Yet the simple fact that contracts for such services have been signed shows that demand continues. Even if half reliable, the possibility of narrowing risks sustains a market. All of this fuels the growth of training programs. From the late 2000s onward, retired military and intelligence figures began offering structured courses in controlled remote viewing to civilians. These programs adopted digital randomizers, online scoring systems, and open protocols modeled on early SRI frameworks. Public participants could now attempt sessions blind, submit sketches, and compare results. Many describe early successes that surprised them, reinforcing the sense that the method is reproducible. This democratization has created an open marketplace where anyone, from hobbyists to investors, can pay to learn. The use of former government personnel in these programs has given them a level of credibility beyond ordinary psychic services. Trainers publicize their involvement in military projects but emphasize discipline and method rather than mysticism. Many courses publish scoring statistics, showing percentages of correct hits in training trials. This transparency contrasts with the secrecy of Stargate while replicating its structure. The effect is striking. What was once locked behind classified access is now taught openly online. While reliability is debated, the existence of training platforms demonstrates the method's persistence. Graduates sometimes move from hobby practice into consulting. Reports describe individuals training for months, then accepting contracts from private clients. In certain cases, they have explored missing person tasks or assisted corporations facing high-cost decisions. Again, results are uneven and often anecdotal. But for those hiring, the possibility of insight, however partial, remains appealing. Enough contracts exist that the practice continues quietly within corporate and investigative contexts. This overlapping landscape, rumored state programs, confirmed commercial applications, and widespread training, forms the present reality of remote viewing in intelligence and beyond. It persists not because it has been validated as decisive, but because across military and civilian sectors, people continue to treat it as potentially useful. Wherever there is even a reported anomaly, funding and practice follow. What remains unresolved is how individuals achieve measurable outcomes under certain conditions. Some records from Stargate highlight striking correspondences. Modern training platforms show modest results under digital protocols. The human factor shapes both. Despite decades of debate, a handful of individuals seem to produce more consistent results than the rest. This draws attention back to the people who defined the original program and how they explain their methods. Among them, one figure continues to stand out as representative of both discipline and controversy. It is here that the discussion turns from institutions to individuals and to the techniques that frame their reputations. McMoney's methods and accuracy. Joseph McMoney approached remote viewing as a skill shaped by discipline and repetition rather than mystical inspiration. He repeatedly emphasized that the practice was about structure and consistency, not visions or fortune-telling. At the center of his method was pattern recognition, the ability to record raw impressions quickly and sift them from irrelevant thoughts before imagination interfered. He argued that the real challenge for viewers was controlling ego. Once a person began assigning meaning to an impression too early, the data became contaminated. McMoney instead stressed following a set process session after session, producing impressions first and interpreting them only when patterns emerged. Those who observed him closely often remarked that his approach resembled military drills more than anything tied to psychic showmanship. His preparation methods also reflected that background. Instead of relying on quiet, controlled laboratory conditions, McMoney deliberately trained in disruptive environments. He described practicing in places with constant noise, moving crowds, or deliberate distractions, believing that accuracy should not collapse under stress. He trained to perform under noise, rejected suggestive validation checklists, and practiced producing raw sensory fragments before analysis. This meant that when asked to view during genuine intelligence tasks, scenarios marked by time pressure and uncertainty, He had already conditioned himself to work without ideal conditions. That refusal to depend on calm settings distinguished him from others who performed well only under carefully shielded laboratory setups. In practice, McMoney's sessions always started small. He wrote down fleeting sensory fragments, temperature, texture, movement, or spatial impressions, without trying to fit them into a story. A sense of large, metallic, structured, cold might be captured on paper in seconds. Sketches followed, constructed through accumulating lines, curves, or shapes that later passed through structured analysis. He taught that the danger lay in jumping too quickly toward recognizable forms. By holding impressions in their raw state and waiting for repetition before calling something significant, he reduced the risk of overlay, the contamination of perception by imagination. Viewers who rushed into labeling a sketch as a tank or a house were, in his view, introducing the very errors the protocol was meant to prevent. Critics generally explained his results differently. They suggested that subconscious processing, cultural knowledge, or inadvertent cues could account for accuracy. For instance, critics argued that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, most Americans involved in defense work knew broadly what the Soviet Union might be constructing. Therefore, they interpreted McMoney's apparent successes as informed guessing under blind conditions, not evidence of perception beyond the ordinary. Yet program documents do not align neatly with that argument. Early SRI tests reportedly produced 5 first-place matches out of 6 trials. These lab records are part of the declassified files and widely cited in McMoney's accounts. Under double-blind protocols, with neither viewer nor monitor aware of the hidden target, such results were difficult for evaluators to dismiss outright. What makes McMoney stand out in the record is the consistency of his statistics over time. Many individuals in the program generated sketches or notes that sometimes looked persuasive, but across larger samples their averages circled back toward chance. McMoney's performance resisted this regression. Across years of testing, reports associate his data with accuracy rates that analysts described as significantly above expectation. Intelligence officers, accustomed to weighing probabilities rather than certainties, grew accustomed to seeing a steady pattern in his transcripts. Even with misses, his overall percentages remained higher than the rest of the pool, convincing more than one sponsor that something in his process warranted ongoing inclusion. As reports were compared across staff, evaluators grouped participants into categories. Most who entered the program did not last beyond initial evaluation. A smaller group displayed intermittent potential, but could not reproduce results in extended trials. Fewer still managed consistent output. Within that limited circle, McMoney was repeatedly listed among the top. Internal notes referred to him as world-class, reflecting not belief in mysticism, but simply a measure of operational dependability compared with hundreds of contemporaries. Without his transcripts, the program's statistical record would look far weaker, and some argue Stargate's funding reviews might have gone differently had his sessions not been part of the archive. His presence provided one of the clearer justifications for calling the process at least promising enough to pursue. Much of that reputation derived from his methods. He emphasized routine, structure, and training against distraction. He insisted on producing sensory fragments before analysis and avoided premature pattern filling. He also resisted experimental formats that invited contamination. For instance, he disliked filling out lists that asked him to check yes/no boxes about specific features. To him, such lists pushed the viewer to imagine details not truly perceived. Rejecting those validation checklists, he instead followed what he called trust the system protocols, allowing impressions to accumulate into a sketch or verbal record on their own. These habits tracked directly back to his military experience. Harnessed discipline, focus amid uncertainty, and refusal to shortcut the process. Beyond the intelligence years, even as a consultant, he carried these attitudes into his work. He never portrayed impressions as revelations from beyond. He presented them as documented outputs from a practiced routine. Clients and later researchers valued this transparency. He maintained thick files of his sessions, organized with hits, misses, and variable results, making it possible to evaluate his performance in ways that psychic entertainers on stage never allowed. Trust in his work did not emerge from claims, but from records observers could evaluate for themselves. Still, criticisms of his sessions never disappeared. The 1995 Air Review specifically raised concerns about whether separate judges scoring his transcripts might have been influenced by unintentional cues. Later critiques revisited high-profile cases, like sessions resembling Soviet submarine facilities, and pointed out that background context about Soviet shipbuilding was already circulating in intelligence at the time. Supporters countered that conditions were structured to prevent direct leakage, but the debate never resolved. The caution most researchers now insert is that even with someone considered the program's best viewer, questions about interjudge reliability and potential background cues shadowed parts of the written record. Those unresolved critiques did not erase his statistical standing. Even decades later, his long sequence of sessions and reported success rates are still cited in publications, training manuals, and modern conferences. In some circles, his averages became a benchmark. Civilian training groups still line up their students' scores and compare them against McMoney's reported record. Whether or not his edge reflects an anomaly beyond conventional explanation, the fact remains that no other viewer has produced the same length and consistency of results under documented protocols. The larger dispute over his place in the story remains. Supporters highlight his accuracy across many years as evidence that remote viewing can work when approached with discipline, especially pointing to his early SRI numbers as a baseline that withstood time. Detractors argue his case proves the opposite, that remote viewing is at best a rare, idiosyncratic talent incapable of scaling, and at worst a demonstration of human pattern recognition elevated into myth. Either way, both sides acknowledge that his is the most complete record of any individual in the program. That dual role, most convincing advocate and most conspicuous target, shaped his reputation long after Stargate closed. By the time newer digital protocols emerged in the 2020s, his data was still invoked as the threshold for serious performers to measure against. Researchers often assessed whether replication attempts could match his early hit rate. Most could not. This left him in the rare position of being continually compared against results decades old. For many, that lasting comparison points less to paranormal ability and more to unusual levels of consistency under blind constraints. Whatever interpretation one accepts, his track record continues to function as a standard against which others are measured. McMoney repeatedly returned to one principle in interviews. Remote viewing was not about seeing visions of the future or accessing hidden channels of information. It was about paying disciplined attention to fragments of perception and structuring them into recorded material without bias. Accuracy, he argued, arose from the rigor applied in the process. Whether this view is seen as evidence of an anomalous perception or as an illustration of human psychology under stress, the body of his work underscored that disciplined structure could produce results that stood out from the ordinary. With that foundation established, the question arises whether such performance can be taught. If one man produced sessions that remain the benchmark decades later, then the natural curiosity is whether others can be trained to reach similar levels. That question, circling around the idea of trainability and reproducibility, became central to the future of remote viewing after Stargate and shapes how it is discussed today. Training the next generation. The question that lingers after looking at McMoney's record is whether his level of performance was entirely unique, or if it proves that remote viewing can be taught. That question has driven nearly every training initiative since the 1980s, and by 2025 it forms the foundation of an entire industry aimed at teaching ordinary people the same protocols once used inside government labs. At the heart of this discussion is the divide between talent and skill. Is remote viewing a rare anomaly limited to a handful of natural performers, or is it a structured process that anyone can learn if they follow the system? Most modern programs trace their systems back to Ingo Swann's controlled remote viewing, or CRV. In the early 1980s, Swann recognized that unstructured sessions quickly slid into imagination. People began with flashes of raw sensory impressions but then rushed to label them, turning a sense of something tall, metallic, into a skyscraper before evidence warranted that interpretation. To prevent this, Swann introduced stages. The first stages capture simple data: sounds, textures, sizes, temperatures. Only later stages invite sketching or linking impressions to broader categories. Modern training often follows CRV stages developed by Ingo Swann, emphasizing stepwise sensory reporting before analysis. This structure keeps the viewer from jumping prematurely to conclusions and provides a workflow that resembles disciplined note-taking more than psychic display. By 2025, CRV remains the backbone of nearly every serious training program. What has changed is the format. Today's training platforms use randomized digital targets, automated scoring, and large cohorts to gather reproducible data. Instead of envelopes holding photographs, participants receive a string of numbers generated by a computer. That number links to a hidden file stored in an encrypted database. Only after the session closes is the target revealed, and the student's sketches or written reports are scored automatically against the image or location. This prevents the chance of an instructor inadvertently leaking information to the trainee, while also building a record that can be reviewed at scale. Thousands of sessions can be logged in ways impossible during Stargate, and those larger datasets allow instructors and researchers to identify patterns across big groups rather than a few hand-picked subjects. The accessibility of training is another crucial change. During the Cold War period, only a limited handful of chosen individuals ever entered secure facilities with clearance to attempt remote viewing. In 2025, anyone with a laptop can log onto structured digital modules. Instructors run workshops over video streams, design home assignments, and invite students to send in written results. Platforms provide instant feedback, comparing the students' notes against encrypted target images. This transparency means beginners can immediately measure whether their output is broadly in line with the actual target, rather than waiting on subjective judgment. For some instructors, this is the most important development of all. The shift from authority-based assessment to automated scoring makes progress easier to track and credibility harder to dispute. But there are trade-offs. Critics argue that commercialization dilutes discipline. Under military oversight, results mattered because they carried direct operational consequences. A sketch that misled officers could waste time and money, or in some cases endanger lives. Civilian training lacks that pressure. Paying students are often encouraged to keep practicing even when their results show little correlation. Skeptics suggest that financial incentives soften feedback and inflate the appearance of success. Programs could appear more effective on paper than they truly are in practice. For those critical voices, the loosened stakes mean the conditions under which students train are inherently less rigorous than those McMoney endured during classified missions. Supporters make a different case. They argue that broader participation allows patterns to be seen in ways that classified projects never could. With thousands of students attempting blind sessions each year and their data captured digitally, researchers can map improvement curves over time. Some report that small but real percentages of beginners show clear correspondences with targets on their first attempt. An early novice may describe curved metallic surfaces when the target turns out to be an airplane hangar, or sketch large arcs that resemble a bridge when that image is later revealed. Advocates point out that this pattern mirrors McMoney's claim that most people can access remote perception at a baseline level, and that structured training is what determines whether that initial spark grows into reliable performance. These early hits from beginners should not be misinterpreted. They often come in partial fragments rather than complete representations of a target. A description of cold metallic surfaces might correlate to any number of industrial objects, reducing its operational value. Still, seeing untrained participants land above chance descriptions suggests that remote viewing may not be exclusive to rare individuals. Instead, it may function under principles of attention, patience, and structure, skills that can be refined, though rarely to the level of the program's top performers. Training opens access to the methods, but operational reliability, reaching the consistency reported by the program's top performers, remains rare. This distinction between potential and mastery defines the current landscape. Civilian training makes participation broad and transparent, while operational accuracy remains elusive. McMoney's protocols highlight why. He demonstrated results under hostile conditions, with distractions, stress, and strict blind protocols. Replicating these conditions in civilian online modules is nearly impossible. Even when students show promising data, the absence of pressure and consequence means they are not tested in the same ways. As a result, training validates the presence of a signal, but does not guarantee that trainees will perform at professional intelligence standards. The biggest challenge identified by instructors today is making consistency repeatable for the majority, rather than episodic for the few. One outcome of widespread platforms is the growth of peer networks. Students often practice in pairs, one acting as monitor, the other as viewer, with both blind to the target. These peer-to-peer sessions replicate some of the oversight once applied in labs, but are managed informally. Results are logged, stored, and sometimes incorporated into larger open-source databases. This generates research datasets available for external audit, something intelligence programs never offered publicly. It also produces an opportunity for comparative studies, a way to measure whether large pools produce stronger averages than isolated government teams did decades ago. Researchers at universities have begun analyzing these datasets, reporting modest but consistent above-chance outcomes. The work remains disputed, but the methods are clearer than ever. Shifts in training also reflect cultural change. Once associated with secrecy and pseudoscience, remote viewing training now operates more like mindfulness or meditation courses, openly advertised, structured around self-improvement, and attracting thousands worldwide. Participants frame their practice not only as testing ESP claims, but also as developing attention, intuition, and creativity. This broad base of motivation ensures training continues even if operational applications remain uncertain. For some, the primary benefit becomes personal development rather than intelligence output, extending the audience beyond professional contexts. Despite that broader reach, expectations are tempered. Both instructors and researchers stress that while the skill may be widespread, achieving reliability comparable to Stargate's best performers has proved rare. Most students plateau at producing occasional correspondences that may impress casually, but would not meet intelligence thresholds. Training demonstrates that the process can be learned, but it does not erase the gulf between casual accuracy and professional dependability. That gap is what makes the subject controversial. Evidence of potential is real, but proof of operational strength remains confined to a handful of cases still debated decades later. The practical implication of these programs is twofold. On one hand, they make the practice common, transparent, and available to anyone with curiosity. On the other, they highlight that reliability is not evenly distributed. Consistency, the vital ingredient for intelligence use, is still rare. Replicating McMoney's record outside classified conditions has not yet occurred on scale. Instead, training reveals the outline of human potential, showing that many carry fragments of ability, but few meet professional thresholds. The democratization of remote viewing shows participation is accessible, but mastery remains the exception. This creates a paradox. If nearly anyone can achieve occasional above-chance impressions, then the phenomenon may reflect something inherent in human perception rather than a rare anomaly. Yet if only a few produce consistent, high-value results, then the phenomenon is also defined by scarcity. Modern training illustrates both sides at once. It opens the door widely, but still leaves operational mastery unresolved. That reality explains why interest remains. The method is not secret, the protocols are widely taught, but the higher bar of intelligence-level performance continues to hover above most practitioners. From that perspective, training represents continuity with the past and expansion into the present. What began as guarded defense experiments has turned into open civilian practice. The conversation is no longer about whether remote viewing can be taught. It can, but about what that training actually delivers. The gulf between everyday practice and intelligence reliability remains as relevant now as it was in the 1990s. Even as open platforms and digitized scoring have made the skill more visible, the larger mystery persists. Public participation shows the method is alive, but the real debate continues around its edges, about reliability, about use in high-stakes settings, and about how technology might reshape the question entirely. The evolution since Stargate's end. In the years following 1995, many assumed remote viewing had closed its chapter for good. With the program officially described as too unreliable for intelligence purposes, it seemed destined to linger as nothing more than a Cold War oddity. Yet away from headlines and outside agency walls, the practice continued. Practitioners refined their methods, small research groups kept the experiments running, and the broader community refused to let the idea disappear. Over time, what emerged was not the sudden return of psychic espionage, but a steady evolution, an effort to make the methods sharper, the data cleaner, and the debate harder to dismiss. One major shift has been technological. During Stargate's lifetime, trials relied on pen-and-paper notes and cassette recordings, with sketches sealed in envelopes and later compared manually to photographs. Accuracy depended on whether judges believed a drawing resembled the target. This raised immediate problems: subjective interpretation, inconsistent standards, and potential unconscious bias. Skeptics often argued that any hit, could be explained by elastic interpretation or selective memory. By contrast, today's trials often employ automated scoring tools. Instead of a human deciding whether a sketch matches a bridge or a shipyard, artificial intelligence systems compare viewer outputs against large image databases, flagging similarities through pattern recognition and assigning statistical scores. The presence of machine-driven evaluation reduces the reliance on human judgment, making bias a smaller factor. This move toward automation also connects back to the methodological debates inside the original program. In the late 1970s through the 1990s, Edwin May and colleagues carried out extensive analyses of how targets themselves influenced results. Their concept of target entropy suggested that images or sites with more complexity and variety were easier for remote viewers to describe than simple, redundant ones. That line of inquiry laid the groundwork for treating remote viewing data in statistical terms, not anecdotal terms. Modern research expands on that trajectory. Meta-analyses conducted up to 2022 show above-chance patterns across many lab studies, while recent work has used entropy measures and automated matching to minimize the subjectivity that critics once saw as the field's weakest point. Linking May's early entropy models with today's AI-driven scoring illustrates a through line, an ongoing attempt to quantify faint signals systematically rather than depend on impressions alone. The importance of this change is that it establishes conditions for replication. AI-based evaluations can be rerun by different labs to confirm whether scoring holds up under independent checks. If one group reports above-chance correspondences, others can test the same outputs without relying on insider judgment. In this sense, automation doesn't prove remote viewing, but it makes the claims more testable. For decades, the debate was framed around subjective interpretation. Today, the conversation shifts toward reproducible metrics, even as the overall effect sizes remain modest and not yet decisive. Neuroscience has contributed another angle that didn't exist when Stargate closed. Researchers can now track tiny neural fluctuations in real time, mapping patterns that occur while participants attempt remote viewing sessions. Some studies report unusual states of coherence, synchronous brainwave activity across regions normally not aligned in everyday tasks. These signatures appear more frequently during trials scored as accurate, suggesting that the state associated with remote viewing can be physiologically marked. The finding remains tentative, but its meaning is significant. Whether or not remote viewing reflects information transfer, it at least correlates with measurable brain states distinct from ordinary imagination. This physiological footprint gives researchers a second layer of evidence to explore, one that can be monitored alongside output scoring to test whether there is a consistent pattern between mind, method, and measurable result. Meanwhile, advances in satellite imaging and information flows have changed intelligence practice itself. During the Cold War, even high-priority reconnaissance could take weeks to confirm, leaving remote viewing sketches as speculative until later images arrived. Today, satellite imagery arrives at near real-time resolution, raising questions about how descriptions could be compared rapidly with conventional data. Rather than replacing satellites, some analysts and researchers propose hybrid approaches, remote viewers offering broad cues that are then quickly checked against live imagery. If a session suggests unusual structures near water, industrial scale, metallic arcs, AI could cross-reference those features with an active image bank in minutes rather than months. This does not resolve whether remote viewing itself is valid, but it demonstrates how modern infrastructure could test its potential more rigorously than ever before. Put together, these advances highlight three key conceptual possibilities often discussed in current circles: AI-based scoring that minimizes subjective bias, neural monitoring as a potential physiological signature, and satellite imagery for rapid cross-validation. Researchers and analysts stress that each element remains exploratory rather than conclusive. Still, the combination suggests an environment where remote viewing data, once plagued by doubts, could be tested quickly and with greater accountability. Whether the outputs will consistently clear the bar of scientific or operational significance remains unresolved. The question of intelligence adoption still echoes. Stargate ended not because every result was wrong, but because the political costs outweighed modest benefits. That calculus hasn't fully changed. Admitting that intelligence services might revisit remote viewing experiments would invite skepticism and ridicule even today. Instead, plausible futures involve reframing the practice not as psychic spying, but as one more experimental data stream, tested through AI filters and neural monitoring, then weighed statistically like any other unconventional sensor. Under such a model, remote viewing would no longer need to stand on its own. It would function as a low-cost input compared alongside signals, intercepts, imagery, or human source reports. Conceptually, the practice could evolve from high-risk gamble to an added layer designed to slightly shift probabilities during analysis. Yet these remain scenarios rather than established practice. The evidence that remote viewing persists at intelligence levels in this form is limited to speculation, commentary, and extrapolation. What we can say more firmly is that the tools now exist to reduce the flaws critics highlighted in the 1970s through 1990s. Early work by May and others showed how structure and entropy analysis could sharpen results. Modern studies continue to probe small but measurable anomalies. Automated metrics now provide a path for replication. Each represents developmental steps in a methodological evolution, not proof of operational return. For past supporters of remote viewing, this modern landscape offers both hope and restraint. Hope because the systematic weaknesses that once undermined the research, bias, queuing, inconsistent scoring, are at least partially addressed by digital protocols and machine evaluation. Restraint because decades of work still yield only modest, contested outcomes. The field's credibility now hinges on whether these tools can sustain consistent above-chance patterns across multiple, independent labs. Absent that, the discipline risks repeating its original trajectory, promising anomalies overshadowed by methodological concerns. Whether remote viewing finds a place again in intelligence, academia, or remains a niche interest outside the mainstream, its evolution since 1995 underscores how debates about perception cannot be fully buried. The conversation has not ended with CIA memos or AIR reviews. It has shifted into new formats: AI pattern recognizers, meta-analytic probability curves, EEG signatures, and digitized archives of thousands of civilian sessions. The program that once seemed closed has re-emerged as a subject tested with methods tougher than those ever applied during the Cold War. None of this guarantees acceptance, but it reveals that the story is not as settled as many once assumed. Looking back, the legacy of Stargate lies less in its classified operations than in how the questions it raised refused to disappear. Each new wave of technology provides little openings where the phenomenon can be reframed, analyzed, and tested again. The debates continue, evidence remains contested, but the persistence of inquiry itself signals that something here resists dismissal. And as we weigh that persistence, we come to a larger frame. Remote viewing's journey is about more than just intelligence experiments. It ties directly into the broader debate over human consciousness, information, and perception itself, a debate that still challenges the boundaries of mainstream science. Remote viewing's legacy is complicated. The record shows some statistical anomalies that still stand out, but not enough to secure full acceptance. Modern research has improved methods with digital protocols, neuromonitoring, and automated scoring, yet it has not produced definitive proof. What endures is the debate itself, the presence of results that keep the subject from being dismissed, matched by failures that keep it from being confirmed. That tension is what makes the story continue. If you found this investigation thought-provoking, leave a comment with the one question you'd ask a remote viewer. And if you want deeper dives like this, hit subscribe. Was Stargate a flawed experiment, or a hint of something real we still don't understand?